Welcome here in Graz. You're going to have a lecture this evening. So, which are your most famous buildings, or which project do you want to introduce today?
I have chosen projects that speak to the theme. I've been invited to come to speak about think tank architecture, which is not really about projects, but about the kind of work that architects do, the kind of things architects think about. So I've selected projects that have to do with that. I've chosen a project we've done in Cape Town, which is a housing project. It was a pilot where we were experimenting with different ways of building and different systems. We chose a sandbag building because it gave us the opportunity to build in a simple way, including the people who were actually going to live in the houses as well, but also to find a kind of material that would improve the thermal performance of the building. We live in a warm climate, and we need to reduce the energy buildup inside buildings, so we need materials that can actually block the heat, but also when the heat is generated inside, we need buildings that can actually absorb the heat and keep it. So we've chosen the 10 by 10 sandbag house because we think it speaks to the challenges that architects are facing today of having to build with cheaper materials, building for poorer people who cannot afford the building materials that are available. We've chosen a building that we've done community projects we've done in another township, Philippi, where there's a center that looks after children of poor families. We built a soup kitchen there, also using sandbags. And this project helps the children to get food before school and after school. And we've now just finished an aftercare building for them, which means that when they come back from school, they've got a facility where they can do homework. They are looked after with social programs, sport, dance, learning computers, because these kids live in a township that does not have the normal facilities. At home, there's no computer. In some homes, there are no lights, so they can't do homework at home. And then we've chosen a new project that we're doing, which is a slum upgrading, also in Cape Town, in a township, and we'll be showing those projects tonight.
Your architecture is inspired strongly by the African culture. Which design elements do you like to use, and why do you use them?
I don't know where you get that from, that we're influenced by African architecture, but we live in Africa. We live in an African country, but we design as best as we can, using design first and foremost to determine how a project is going to look like. But obviously, because we live in an African country, the climate is very, very important to understand, which therefore means that the things you choose in buildings are the ones that reduce the amount of heat that the building generates. Because I don't work with highly commercial projects where you can afford air conditioning and all these things. I work with very simple community projects, schools, community housing, and that kind of work. So there, you have very limited costs. So we have to make sure that we manage the natural climate using natural ways. Allow natural ventilation as much as possible, reduce the amount of sun that penetrates into the building so that you don't have much heat. And when there's heat inside the building, it must be kept, it must not escape. So climate is very decisive in our work. Creating shade for spaces around buildings, shading windows, making sure that windows don't get direct sun. These are the elements we use. We have people who have got very strong cultural lifestyles, people who love to live in a communal way, people who don't have just one kid or two children. People have got 4 or 5 children, then comes the grandma, then comes the aunt, then comes the uncle. So the house has got to grow, but also has got to contract sometimes. So you always have to prepare for the building to be able to grow as the family grows. In African countries, unlike maybe in Germany where a child gets to 18 years and then is expected to leave, in Africa kids live with their family until either they get married or they get a job where they can live by themselves. So a house has to accommodate different generations, young, old, and grandma or grandparents. And obviously we don't have a lot of variety of materials because of the financial constraints. So we use color in a lot of our buildings because we think that what helps to create environments that are playful, that are interesting, that also give people a sense of identity with their individual houses. So that's the things we work with. We try to work with natural materials as much as possible because in ancient times, in all of Africa, buildings are never meant to be permanent. They are meant to be an ever-growing, ever-changing phenomenon. So where I grew up, people use adobe, mud, combined with wood, all natural materials that will disintegrate over time. But when it disintegrates, people just do another one. So there's nothing like you are building a house as a permanent kind of phenomenon. But obviously today, you don't expect people to be building and rebuilding their house. The idea of using natural materials is about making sure that you don't need high maintenance to look after buildings. They should look after themselves. So those are things that influence me, and that's how I go about architecture.
You have been imprisoned and then you had to go to exile to Germany. How does your personal life experience influences your kind of planning buildings or seeing architecture, and your combination of African and Germany? How does this influence your kind of architecture?
I think the last part of your question is more interesting because that I think I can talk about. I started architecture before going to prison, so I don't think it would really influence me, except that maybe I like open spaces, I like transparent spaces. I try to make sure that buildings enable people to have a better connection with the outside. But that has nothing to do with prison, but maybe, I don't know. But I've always believed that spaces must not be confined, and there must be a good relationship between internal and outside. That's more African rather than prison, maybe. But I think the fact that I came to Germany and spent 15 years there in exile has had an influence, a lot of influence in the way I think. German education is perhaps more rational. Everything is well calculated, and you've got to learn about the grid and all those things. But also learn about how different materials can work together, and also learn about how buildings are made in Germany. I was fortunate to build our South African embassy in Berlin when I finished. And there, I would say we did our best to combine African influences and the German rational Wärmedämmung type building, which had to meet the climate conditions of a cold country, but at the same time using materials that make the building have some African features. So I think that combination was important because in our country, buildings tend to express the culture of people. Buildings tend to include artwork, for example, because people associate a lot with culture. People love, I'll use fashion as an example. A lot of African fashion is about taking old traditional lifestyles and converting them into very modern, high-quality fashion. Now, architecture doesn't do that because architecture is a bit slow and it's a bit conservative. But in African buildings, you'll always find that there's a lot of introduction of that cultural side of life into the building. So in Berlin, for example, when we did our embassy, we had to think about how do we represent South Africa in Germany. It was just after Nelson Mandela had become the first president. It was South Africa having been reintroduced into the world after years of isolation because of apartheid. It was the first building to be built by the new government. And we were young students, just finished university, having a chance to build an embassy. So the things we thought about were transparency. The building has to be transparent because South Africa was seeing itself as a transparent country. The building had to be democratic. For example, we changed the whole idea of an embassy being made up of different departments and all of them cellular. We made the building open and we created a big atrium space, which in Europe is normal, by the way, atrium spaces. But for South Africa, it was never done before that a building would be so open. So we used what we learned in Europe, the Hof, as a gathering space. We created that into the building itself. But we do have, all houses in African countries have got a meeting space in the middle, in the open though. It's not a closed space. So we used those two combinations, ein Hof and the inkundla, as it is called in my language, which is a gathering space. And we said, okay, we'll combine those two to make our building have meeting spaces inside it. And all the departments are actually meeting in this central space. We chose materials from South Africa. We chose a sandstone from South Africa. We brought it here via Italy. We chose granite stone from Zimbabwe, also brought to Germany. We chose timber finishes from timber, which is from Mozambique in Southern Africa. So we basically said that the building should not have an African aesthetic just by the way you look at it, but by the way we've built it, by the way we've put different materials together. And all these materials were finished here, high quality, but they were imported from Southern Africa. So for us, it was just important that the building has an African flair, but finish in high quality materials as would be needed to be approved in Germany. So that combination, I think, was very important. And I can say that we are fortunate in that everybody who comes to our building, even up to today, people say that it's got a very special kind of experience to go through it. In fact, you can have a tour, a guided tour. We also included artists from South Africa who came to do some of the artwork on the building itself, which therefore means that it was genuine, it was authentic. We didn't just mimic, because as architects, we're not artists, we're artists for buildings maybe. So we combined the architecture, the artwork, using materials from Southern Africa, but using the very German rush. Our building is square, everything is square, nothing round, because I think it wouldn't fit in Germany.